Counting on the time.
The committee will come to order. After recognizing myself and the ranking member, Mr. Berman, for 7 minutes each for our opening statements, we will then hear from our witnesses, Deputy Secretary William Burns and Deputy Secretary Tom Nides, no strangers to our committee, and so that we can allow members to question our witnesses directly as soon as possible, we will forego additional opening statements, and instead I will recognize each member for 6 minutes following the presentation by our witnesses. Secretary Clinton was originally scheduled to be here today, but we've had to reschedule her appearance due to the unfortunate injury, from which we all wish her a speedy and healthy recovery. She has confirmed once and again that she has every intention of testifying before our committee by mid-January, as soon as she gets the go-ahead from her doctor. So we will welcome the Secretary to our committee in mid-January. Before I begin my opening statement, I would like to raise the case of U.S. citizen John Hammer, a proud Marine who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and who is unjustly incarcerated in Mexico. I'm giving you, gentlemen, a bipartisan letter addressed to Secretary Clinton, signed by close to 70 of my House colleagues, asking for the administration's immediate intervention with Mexican authorities to secure John Hammer's release, as well as a letter from John's parents, who are constituents of my district. I thank you, gentlemen. If you could make sure that the Secretary gets it. I'll begin my opening statement. When Secretary Clinton transmitted the report of the ARB, the Accountability Review Board, to our committee, she noted in her accompanying letter that all of us have a responsibility to provide the men and women who serve this country with the best possible security and support. Most of all, she says, it is my responsibility as Secretary of State. Tragically, the department did not meet its responsibility to our personnel in Libya. The lethal attack on our diplomatic mission in Benghazi was not the result of a protest against an obscure video, as was initially claimed. Instead, and as the evidence makes clear, the attack was coordinated and carried out by terrorists targeting U.S. personnel. After the attack that killed Ambassador Stevens, Seth Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty, the Secretary of State convened an ARB, which is required by statute due to the fatalities at the post. The ARB states that the attacks on our U.S. mission in Benghazi on September 11th of this year were, and I quote, terrorist attacks. Contrary to initial assertions by the Obama administration, the ARB states that the attacks were security-related and did not involve a protest prior to the attacks, which were unanticipated in their scope and intensity. Dispatches from the command center of the State Department's Bureau of Diplomatic Security on the day of the attack clearly reported it as a terrorist event. Yet officials in Washington refused to recognize and label the attack both during and after September 11th for what it was. The ARB finds that the failures in leadership and management reached senior levels and resulted in a security posture at the diplomatic compound that was inadequate for Benghazi and grossly inadequate to deal with the attack that took place. This was not the result of insufficient information nor lack of warning. As the ARB clearly states, the responsible officials at the State Department overlooked mounting evidence that the security situation in Benghazi was deteriorating. They ignored the series of attacks against Western interests in the months and weeks leading up to 9/11 and failed to respond to the urgent requests and pressing needs of those on the ground. Given the extensive series of Emergency Action Committee reports and diplomatic security spot reports that indicated that the security situation in eastern Libya was going from bad to worse, why was the State Department unprepared for an assault there, especially on the anniversary of the worst terrorist attack in United States history? The report provides the beginning of an answer when it states that there was a pervasive realization among personnel who served in Benghazi that the special mission was not a high priority when it came to security-related requests. If security was not a priority, just what was the priority of the State Department in Libya and in Benghazi in particular? But we should be careful not to focus our attention entirely on the tragic failure in Benghazi and regard it as an isolated incident. One cannot look at the evidence and conclude anything other than that it was a systematic failure with far broader and more worrisome implications. We cannot expect the same bureaucracy at state, whose management failures are now manifest, to objectively review the department's organization, procedure, and performance. Nor can we have any confidence in their assessment of what went wrong and what actions are needed to prevent a repeat. Unfortunately, the closer one looks, the more troubling the situation is, and the resignation yesterday of Eric Boswell, Charlene Lamb, and Raymond Maxwell should not shift our attention from the broader systemic failures at the State Department bureaucracy in Washington that this report has clearly revealed. Why, for example, has State ignored the longstanding recommendation of the Government Accountability Office that the Department perform a strategic review that will enable it to adequately plan and carry out the necessary security mission for our diplomats abroad? Using the ARB as a guide, our priority must be to uncover the root causes of this tragedy and ensure that all necessary actions are taken to prevent a recurrence. I know that there will be an attempt to shift the responsibility for this tragedy to a shortage of resources. Requests for more money are a familiar refrain in previous State Department ARB reports. But budgetary constraints were not a factor in the Department's failure to recognize the threats and adequately respond to the situation in Benghazi. The problem was and is about misplaced priorities. If the State Department intends to blame its long string of failures on inadequate funding, then perhaps it should take a closer look at the money that is being lavished on global climate change, culinary diplomacy programs, and other favored projects. This money could have been used for providing diplomatic security, including hiring additional personnel and providing them with adequate equipment and training. This report and this hearing are just the beginning of our efforts to provide the American people with answers as to why this tragedy occurred and how to protect our diplomats and other personnel serving overseas from unnecessary risks in the future. For in their devotion to duty, these brave men and women are putting their lives on the line for us, and we on this committee and in this Congress have no less a duty to them. I yield back the balance of my time, and I'm pleased to yield to my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Berman of California.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairman, for convening this hearing to continue our examination of how we should give our government officials serving around the world the necessary protection to carry out their jobs. First, I'd like to wish Secretary Clinton, as you have, a speedy recovery and hope she gets some well-deserved rest. As she nears the end of her service as Secretary of State, I think it is an appropriate time to recognize the strong and steadfast leadership she has demonstrated over the past 4 years. Among her many achievements, she has put the problems of women and girls in the forefront and helped make their voices heard around the world. The Secretary has brought needed attention to the dangers of repressive governments, including through her important emphasis on Internet freedom. She initiated the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review to improve the work of our international affairs agencies, and she has been a leading advocate for the use of smart power, which advances the role of diplomacy, international alliances, multilateral institutions, public-private partnerships, and foreign assistance in protecting our national security. We're fortunate today to have two people who have worked closely with her to make all these accomplishments possible, Deputy Secretaries Bill Burns and Thomas Nides. I thank you both for your service and appreciate your willingness to be here today. As we examined in last month's hearing, the tragic events in Benghazi painfully demonstrate the ongoing threats faced by our diplomats and development workers serving abroad. We must do our best to minimize the risks faced by these brave public servants and provide adequate funding to do so. But we must also recognize that such risks can never be completely eliminated. Ambassador Chris Stevens and his colleagues understood the hazards of their jobs and appreciated that in order to advance America's interests and effect positive change in the world, we can't isolate ourselves behind embassy walls or limit the deployment of our diplomats to low-risk environments. It's important that we meet with the Afghan village elder, work with the Yemeni school teacher, assist the female activist in South Sudan. One of the reasons Ambassador Stevens traveled to Benghazi was to open an American corner, a place where average Libyans could go to learn more about the United States and American values. At last month's hearing on Benghazi, Ambassador Ronald Newman framed the issue well. How much risk are we willing to take to accomplish a particular mission, and how important is that mission to our national purpose? In high-risk environments, our policymakers must ask and answer these difficult but necessary questions. In some cases, the benefits will outweigh the danger. In other cases, they may not. The Accountability Review Board, chaired by Ambassador Thomas Pickering, just submitted its report this week. I would like to thank Ambassador Pickering, Admiral Mullen, and the other members of the board for agreeing to take on this solemn responsibility. The report reaches a number of troubling conclusions. Perhaps the most serious is that years of congressional paring away of the President's diplomatic security funding requests have not only seriously diminished the resources available for security at our posts, but has also created a culture at the State Department that is more preoccupied with saving money than with achieving its security goals. The repeated rejection of requests for security upgrades at the mission in Benghazi is, some would argue, a manifestation of this culture. The report also notes that a failure of leadership in the bureaus of Near Eastern Affairs and diplomatic security significantly contributed to inadequate security at the Benghazi mission. This bureaucratic breakdown included a lack of shared responsibility, resulting in stovepipe decisions on policy and security rather than a holistic approach. I'm pleased that Secretary Clinton has announced that the State Department is already beginning to implement all of the ARB's recommendations and take additional steps to address security concerns. For example, she recently named the first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary for high-threat posts in the Diplomatic Security Bureau. That will ensure that missions located in high-risk areas like Libya and Yemen get the bureaucratic attention they deserve. The Department has also submitted the increased security proposal, which would boost the number of diplomatic security personnel and give them greater capabilities. It would also provide enhanced security at older facilities while accelerating construction at posts in high-threat areas. In addition, it would call for an increase in the number of Marine Security Guard detachments, which, among other things, are responsible for protecting classified information. In reviewing this and other proposals, we must carefully consider how best to mitigate the risks faced by the brave men and women who serve the United States around the world, while at the same time preserving their ability to do their jobs in a way that promotes America's national interest. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Berman, for your statement. Now I would like to introduce our witnesses. William J. Burns holds the highest rank in the Foreign Service, Career Ambassador, and became Deputy Secretary of State in July of 2011. He is only the second serving career diplomat in history to become Deputy Secretary. Ambassador Burns served from 2008 till 2011 as Undersecretary for Political Affairs. He was Ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008, Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs from 2001 to 2005, and ambassador to Jordan from 1998 to 2001. Ambassador Burns has also served in a number of other posts since entering Foreign Service in 1982, including Executive Secretary of the State Department and Special Assistant to the Secretaries Christopher and Albright, and Acting Director and Principal Deputy Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff. Ambassador Burns is the recipient of 2 Presidential Distinguished Service Awards and a number of Department of State awards, and all well-earned. Thank you, Bill. Thomas Nides is the Deputy Secretary of State for Management and Resources, serving as Chief Operating Officer of the department. Prior to joining the administration, Mr. Nides was the Chief Operating Officer of Morgan Stanley from 2005 to 2010. Before joining Morgan Stanley, Mr. Nides served as the Worldwide President and Chief Executive Officer of Burson Marsteller and as Chief Administrative Officer of Credit Suisse First Boston, the investment banking division of Zurich-based Credit Suisse Group. Mr. Nides began his career in Capitol Hill as an assistant to the Majority Whip of the United States House of Representatives and executive assistant to the Speaker of the House. Mr. Nides later served as Senior Vice President of Fannie Mae and as Chief of Staff to the United States Trade Representative. Welcome, gentlemen, and if you would please rise so I could swear you in. Thank you. Please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief? Let the record show that the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, gentlemen. And we will begin with you.
Madam Chairman, one housekeeping matter.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the Secretary Clinton's letter to you as chairman and me as ranking member be included in the record of this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Berman, and I meant to do that as well, so I'm glad that he's cleaning up after my sloppy act. Thank you. Without objection, the Secretary's letter will be included as part of the record. I apologize for that. Mr. Burns, Ambassador Burns, we will begin with you, sir.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Mr. Berman, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity. Secretary Clinton asked me to express how much she regrets not being able to be here today, and I know she has confirmed to you, Madam Chair, her willingness to appear before you in January.
Thank you.
Since the terrorist attacks on our compounds in Benghazi, State Department officials and senior members from other agencies have testified in 4 congressional hearings, provided more than 20 briefings for members and staff, and submitted thousands of pages of documents, including now the full classified report of the Accountability Review Board. Secretary Clinton has also sent a letter covering a wide range of issues for the record. So today I'd like to highlight just a few key points. The attacks in Benghazi took the lives of 4 courageous Americans. Ambassador Stevens was a friend and a beloved member of the State Department community for 20 years. He was a diplomat's diplomat, and he embodied the very best of America. Even as we grieved for our fallen friends and colleagues, we took action on 3 fronts. First, we took immediate steps to further protect our people and our posts. We stayed in constant contact with embassies and consulates around the world facing large protests, dispatched emergency security teams, received reporting from the intelligence community, and took additional precautions where needed. You'll hear more about all this from my partner, Tom Nides. Second, we intensified a diplomatic campaign aimed at combating the threat of terrorism across North Africa. We continue to work to bring to justice the terrorists responsible for the attacks in Benghazi. And we are working with our partners to close safe havens, cut off terrorist finances, counter extremist ideology, and slow the flow of new recruits. And third, Secretary Clinton ordered an investigation to determine exactly what happened in Benghazi. I want to convey our appreciation to the Accountability Review Board's chairman and vice chairman, Ambassador Tom Pickering, and former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, and also Hugh Turner, Richard Shinnick, and Catherine Bertini. The board's report takes a clear-eyed look at serious systemic problems, problems which are unacceptable, problems for which, as Secretary Clinton has said, we take responsibility, and problems which we have already begun to fix. Before Tom walks you through what we're doing to implement fully all of the board's recommendations, I'd like to add a few words based on my own experiences as a career diplomat in the field. I have been a very proud member of the Foreign Service for more than 30 years, and I've had the honor of serving as a chief of mission overseas. I know that diplomacy, by its very nature, must sometimes be practiced in dangerous places. As Secretary Clinton has said, our diplomats cannot work in bunkers and do their jobs. When America is absent, there are consequences. Our interests suffer, and our security at home is threatened. Chris Stevens understood that as well as anyone. Chris also knew that every chief of mission has the responsibility to ensure the best possible security and support for our people. As senior officials here in Washington, we share that profound responsibility. We have to constantly improve, reduce the risks our people face, and make sure they have the resources they need. That includes the men and women of the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service. I have been deeply honored to serve with many of these brave men and women. They are professionals and patriots who serve in many places where there are no Marines at post and little or no U.S. military presence in country. Like Secretary Clinton, I trust them with my life. It's important to recognize that our colleagues in the Bureaus of Diplomatic Security and Near East Affairs and across the department, at home and abroad, get it right countless times a day for years on end in some of the toughest circumstances imaginable. We cannot lose sight of that. But we learned some very hard and painful lessons in Benghazi. We are already acting on them. We have to do better. We owe it to our colleagues who lost their lives in Benghazi. We owe it to the security professionals who acted with such extraordinary heroism that awful night to try to protect them. And we owe it to thousands of our colleagues serving America with great dedication every day in diplomatic posts around the world. We will never prevent every act of terrorism or achieve perfect security, but we will never stop working to get better and safer. As Secretary Clinton has said, the United States will keep leading and keep engaging around the world, including in those hard places where America's interests and values are at stake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Nides.
Madam Chairman, Congressman Berman, members of the committee, I also thank you for this opportunity. I want to reiterate what Bill has said. All of us who have had the responsibility to provide the men and the women who serve this country with the best possible security and support. From the senior department leadership setting the priorities, to the supervisors evaluating the security needs, to the Congress appropriating sufficient funds, we all share this responsibility. Secretary Clinton has said that as Secretary of State, this is her greatest responsibility and her highest priority. Today I will focus on the steps we are taking at Secretary Clinton's direction and will continue to take. As Bill said, the board report takes a clear-eyed look at the serious systemic problems for which we take responsibility and that we have already begun to fix. We are grateful for the recommendations from Ambassador Pickering and his team. We accept every one of them, all 29 recommendations. Secretary Clinton has charged my office with leading the task force that will ensure that the 29 are implemented as quickly and as completely, and to pursue steps above and beyond the board's report. The Undersecretary of Political Affairs, the Undersecretary for Management, the Director General of the Foreign Service, and the Deputy Legal Advisor will work with me to drive this forward. The task force has already met to translate the recommendations into about 60 specific action items. We've assigned every single one of responsible bureau for immediate implementation, and several of them will be completed by the end of the calendar year. Implementation of each and every recommendation will be underway by the time the next Secretary of State takes office. There will be no higher priority for the Department in the coming weeks and months. And should we require more resources to execute these recommendations, we will work closely with the Congress to ensure that these needs are met. And as I said, Secretary Clinton wants to implement the ARB findings and to do more. So let me offer some very clear specifics. For more than 200 years, the United States, like every other country around the world, has relied on host nations to provide the security for our embassies and consulates. But in today's evolving threat environment, we have to take a new, harder look at the capabilities and the commitments of our hosts. We have to re-examine how we operate in places facing emerging threats, where national security forces are fragmented or may be weak. So, at Secretary Clinton's direction, we moved quickly to conduct a worldwide review of our overall security posture with particular scrutiny on the number of high-threat posts. With the Department of Defense, we deployed 5 interagency security assessment teams made up of diplomat and military security experts to 19 posts and into 13 countries, an unprecedented cooperation between the departments at a very critical time. These teams have provided a roadmap for addressing emerging security challenges. We're also partnering with the Pentagon to send 35 additional detachments of Marine security guards. That's about 225 Marines to medium and high threat posts where they will serve as a visible deterrence to hostile acts. This is on top of the approximately 150 detachments we already deployed. We're aligning resources in our 2013 budget request to address physical vulnerabilities and reinforce structures wherever needed to reduce the risk from fire. And let me add, we may need your help in ensuring that we have the authority to streamline the usual processes that produce faster results. We're seeking to hire more than 150 additional diplomatic security personnel, an increase of 5%, and to provide them with the equipment and training that they need. And as the ARB recommended, we will target them squarely at securing our high-threat posts. I want to second Bill's praise for these brave security professionals. I've served in this department for only 2 years, having come from the private sector. However, as I've traveled to places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, I've seen firsthand how these dedicated men and women risk their lives. We all owe them a debt of gratitude as they go to work every day to protect more than 275 posts around the world. And as we make these improvements in the field, we're also making changes here in Washington. We've named the first ever Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for high-threat posts within the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. We're updating our diplomatic procedures to increase the number of experienced and well-trained staff serving in those posts. And we are working to ensure that the State Department makes decisions about where our people operate in the ways that reflect our shared responsibility for our security. Our regional assistant secretaries were directly involved in our interagency security assessment process, and they will assume greater accountability for securing their people and posts. We'll provide this committee with detailed reports every step we're taking to improve our security and implement the board's recommendation. We look to you for the support and guidance as we do this. Obviously, part of this is about resources. We must equip our people with what they need to deliver results and safety, and we'll work with you as the needs arise. But Congress has a bigger role than just that. You have visited our posts. You know our diplomats on the ground and the challenges that they face. You know our vital national securities are at stake and that we're all in this together. We look forward to working with you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for your support and counsel and for this opportunity to discuss these important matters. We both be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, to you both. And I would suggest that at the very least the President appoint an Inspector General from outside the state bureaucracy to ensure that the recommendations are adequately implemented. I will ask one question on the state's misplaced allocations and one on the bogus protest over video narrative. The ARB notes that there was a view that Maine State did not consider Benghazi a priority. If we look at September 10th, 2012, just the day before the most recent 9/11 terrorist attacks against the U.S. and our people, we see that Secretary Clinton was engaged in launching a new program called the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership, where American chefs will travel the world to engage in culinary diplomacy. Certainly, this is an example of misplaced priorities. As such, what assurances can you provide to Congress that the State Department's budget request will prioritize U.S. national security and the security of our diplomatic personnel, especially at high-risk posts, over such programs like the Diplomatic Culinary Partnership or over the close to the $1 billion that is allocated for global climate change programs? And secondly, who specifically changed Susan Rice's public talking points by eliminating references to al-Qaeda, and why? If there was a national security concern, what was it? When did the inaccurate, spontaneous protest narrative originate? Where did it originate? And why was that story deemed more fit for publication than the accurate terrorism evidence? And if Ambassador Rice had little direct knowledge of the facts on the ground in Benghazi, why was she selected by the administration to be the spokesperson on this subject? Ambassador Burns.
Well, Madam Chair, on your second question, and I'll turn to Tom on the first with regard to the budget. What happened in Benghazi on September 11th was clearly a terrorist attack. Secretary Clinton addressed that directly the following morning in her first public statement when she talked about an assault by heavily armed militants on our compound. Later that same day, President Obama talked of an act of terror. What was not clear that day was who exactly was involved, which terrorists were responsible, what their motives were, how exactly this terrorist attack came about, whether it was planned well in advance or more a target of opportunity. I am confident that the senior administration officials who spoke to this issue and the intelligence community experts on whom they relied acted in good faith throughout this period. Their focus was on trying to be as factual as possible. Their focus was on actions because, Madam Chair, as you know, there were a number of other concerns in this period. Over that period of days, we had mobs coming over the walls of our embassies in Cairo, in Tunis, and in Sana'a. And that was a very heavy focus for Secretary Clinton and for people across the administration. As we were able to clear up the inaccuracies in the original assessments, because as the ARB points out, there was no protest or demonstration before the attack took place. But it did take the intelligence community some days to determine that that was inaccurate as they debriefed the survivors of the attack on Benghazi. I'm sure our colleagues in the intelligence community wish that they could have cleared up those inaccuracies sooner, and they did it as quickly as they could, and then were in direct touch with the Congress and briefed you on it.
Madam Chair, as you are well aware, not only have I spent in the last 2 years up here daily making sure that we have the resources for the men and women who support the State Department. There's no one that cares more about this than I do is Secretary Clinton, who has spent tireless hours making sure that every dollar, and I mean every dollar, that we use for taxpayers are used effectively. As you are well aware of, that the budget of the State Department, for everything we do, including all the assistance we give, including aid to Israel, all the assistance we do for everything around the world, to the programs of PEPFAR, to supporting the 275 posts around the world for all of our staff, for everything we do, is less than 1% of the federal budget. We fight every single day to make sure we have the right resources, but as importantly, we make sure that it is a dime that is not wasted. We understand the importance of the budgetary constraint that this committee and this Congress is going through, and I assure you that we are thinking every day how we can make sure that every dollar is used wisely to protect our people, to provide the assistance around the world to the people who deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you. On the specific questions regarding Susan Rice, do you have anything further to add about the talking points and the references? Because in emails, as the attacks were underway, the Diplomatic Security Operations Command Center was calling it a terrorist attack as it was underway. So it's not like the picture was clear several days later while the attack was taking place in emails.
Well, Madam Chair, as I said, both the Secretary and the President on September 12th, I think, addressed in very clear terms what happened and what the nature of the attack was. Second, the talking points that you referred to were produced by the CIA. I think the CIA has briefed a number of people on the Hill about the process that they went through and I'm sure they'd be glad to, come up and answer in more detail.
And in my last 5 seconds, just to reiterate, we're glad that the Secretary is going to implement every recommendation, but we hope that there's an Inspector General, because without that, we have seen that the recommendations from previous ARBs have not been heeded. Thank you very much. Mr. Berman is recognized.
Madam Chairman, I'm going to pass my opportunity to question now and hold it till the end, if I might.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, very much. Thank you, Mr. Berman. Thank you for your extraordinary service. And you certainly are going to be one that's going to be missed around these meeting rooms. This might be my final 6 moments to speak in my 30-year career here. And I want to first start by apologizing to the Deputy Secretaries, because you have been brought here as a ruse. We were being used as foils to the conflicting intentions of some people on our committee and others in Washington for partisan political purposes. And I'm not here really to explain how we can work together more cooperatively as Americans to make things better. But my great fear as I leave here is that we've become a partisan, bickering bunch of grousing old people trying to exploit whatever we can to our own political advantage. We've become a group of small people with press secretaries. We become people who want to exploit any kind of national calamity to our political advantage of our party. And the public is sick and tired of it, as they should be. We need 2 viable political parties in this country to make our democracy work. We need 2 at least distinct parties explaining their viewpoints and their values and their road to our collective success, and put choices before the American people. And to my friends on the other side, I would like to suggest that you re-examine your approach, because I thought, in my personal, individual opinion, that the voters didn't reject your policies. They rejected your attitude. We should be working together and not at cross purposes. We should respect everybody in our government for the good efforts that they put forth, including, especially the President of the United States, and not refer to him in such vile terms. Trying to take down and disqualify an administration as being illegitimate. Trying to quibble around here on this particular issue of the narrative rather than how we work together to make things better, to quibble over somebody said a particular word or didn't use the right word, rather than figure out how to avoid the mistakes that might have been made to not lose American lives on into the future. That's what we should be doing together as Americans. Anything less is demeaning to the process and to ourselves as good, decent human beings. We have much more to offer than that. And I would suggest that derogatorily looking at the Secretary of State, who has worked herself to the bone, to the point of dehydration and exhaustion, of traversing the globe, teaching cooking classes or some nonsense rather than doing things that are serious, does a disservice to the job that she has done in the name of all of us. Certainly, she's a qualified individual who can both cook and talk policy at the same time and try to bring the peoples of the world together with a respect for the United States and what we really stand for and what our values truly are. Sorry if I'm interrupting anybody over there. More has been done in the few short weeks in this administration to try to look into what went wrong than in the previous dozen years. This administration has given a serious look at what has gone on here and has made recommendations that they're looking to implement with our input as quickly as possible instead of our quibbling over nonsense. Instead, we talk about whether or not it was motivated by a video or it wasn't motivated by the video. These are complicated situations, and we have to approach them seriously. More has been done on this particular issue, in which four wonderful lives were lost, than in all of the time in the previous war, the longest war in the history of the country. Not 4, not 40, not 400, but 4,000 lives were lost. And how many heads rolled? How serious did we look into it? Listen, I disagreed with presidents of the United States, but I disagreed as a matter of policy. But once that was our policy, he was still our president, and I still wanted him to succeed, because the failure of a president is the failure of the nation. Disagree with the policy, but once it's the policy, try to make it work, try to make it better, rather than to try to bring down an administration and to quibble and fight. We've taken the train off the tracks. I would be very pleasantly surprised if one of our colleagues, even one of our colleagues, had on his or her agenda today to talk about any one of the 29 points and recommendations that were made and say, is this particular one good or bad, or can we strengthen it, or should it be in there? Because we've not really, I apologize again, come to do that. We've come here to either play defense or offense and defend our point of view rather than do what's right in the name of our country. It's really been an honor and a pleasure to serve with all of you, and we do have different opinions.
Thank you. The gentleman's time is up.
I will be one of those private citizens on the other
Mr.
side of the
Ackerman, we
television
all
holding you
aspire to your
accountable.
purity, but the flesh is weak. Mr. Smith
thank you
is
for your
recognized
genteel
for his
expertise,
6 minutes. He is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health and Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, on March 12, 1999, I chaired a hearing, the fourth in a series, that focused on the findings of the two accountability review boards that had been established to probe the August 7, 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. Admiral William Crouch, chair of those two boards, told my subcommittee that the car bombs killed more than 220 people, including 12 U.S. Embassy employees and family members, and 32 Kenyan national employees of the United States government, and injured more than 4,000 Americans, Kenyans, and Tanzanians. He said the ARBs were, quote, most disturbed by two intertwined issues. First, the inadequacy of resources to provide security against terrorist attacks, and second, the relatively low priority accorded security concerns throughout the U.S. government by the U.S. Department of State. Admiral Krause sat in 1999, right where Secretary Burns and Nides sit, and said, in our investigations of the bombings, the boards were shocked how similar the lessons were to those drawn by the Bobby Inman commissions some 14 years ago, close quote. Of course, that was in 1985. In direct response to Admiral Krause's recommendations, I sponsored a bipartisan law, the Secure Embassy Construction and Counterterrorism Act of 1999, that authorized $4.5 billion over 5 years for the acquisition of U.S. diplomatic facilities and residence and other structures located in close proximity of such facilities, and to provide major security enhancements to U.S. diplomatic facilities. That law beefed up security requirements for U.S. diplomatic facilities, including threat assessments, emergency action plans, security environment lists, threat lists, site selections, perimeter distance, the setbacks, crisis management training, diplomatic security training, rapid response procedures, storage of emergency equipment, and increased anti-terrorism training in Africa. I read the new ARB, and it almost says the exact same thing. Bipartisan appropriations bills since 1999 have funded the Department of State's Bureau of Overseas Building Operations, has completed 95, at least 95, new diplomatic facilities, and has an additional 40 projects in design or construction. So much has been done. Obviously, we can always do better. I would note, parenthetically, that there are now at least 3,114 diplomatic security personnel. In 1998, there were less than 1,000 security specialists. That's a threefold increase and that is significant. We need more, perhaps, but that is significant. So when it comes to resources, and of course, as I said, we can always do a better job, authorities and funds have been increased to systematically boost worldwide U.S. Embassy security over the past dozen years. Of particular concern is the fact that the Benghazi ARB, chaired by Ambassador Pickering, seems to make nearly identical points, using language that, and I read them side by side again last night, that are almost verbatim to the boards that were chaired by Admiral Crow. The Pickering ARB cites systemic failures in leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 bureaus of the State Department. Admiral Crow's ARB said, and I quote, "The boards found that intelligence provided no immediate tactical warnings of the August 7th attack." Ambassador Pickering's ARB said, "The board found that intelligence provided no immediate specific tactical warning of the September 11th attacks." I would point out to my colleagues that according to the New York Times, and this is a quote, in the spring of 1998, Prudence Bushnell, the U.S. ambassador to Kenya, sent an emotional letter to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright begging for the Secretary's personal help. The January 9, 1999 Times article said that Ms. Bushnell, a career diplomat, had been fighting for months for a more secure embassy in the face of mounting terrorist threats. Secretary Albright, the New York Times reports, took no action. And 3 months later, on August 7th, the American embassies in Tanzania and Kenya were simultaneously bombed by car bombs. The Pickering Benghazi ARB found that the number of Bureau of Diplomatic Security staff in Benghazi on the day of the attack and in the months and weeks leading up to it was inadequate, despite repeated requests from Special Mission Benghazi and Embassy Tripoli for additional staffing. The Pickering report says that there was a pervasive realization among personnel who served in Benghazi that it was not a high priority. So my questions, a couple of questions, 3 of them. In the lead up to the attacks, were President Obama, Vice President Biden, or Secretary Clinton aware of the repeated requests for upgrades? Secondly, why weren't President Obama and Vice President Biden and Secretary Clinton interviewed by the Pickering ARB? How can one examine all the circumstances without interviewing the very top leadership? And finally, in 1999, Admiral Crow released a list of over 100 individuals interviewed. Has the Benghazi ARB list of interviewees been made public? I yield.
I'd be glad to start, Mr. Smith, and then turn to Tom. On your first 2 questions, to the best of my knowledge, the specific security requests that were made, as you mentioned, from Benghazi as well as from Embassy Tripoli did not get as far as Secretary Clinton. You'd have to direct the other question to the White House, but with regard to Secretary Clinton, I believe that's accurate to say. Second, I'm sorry, your second question? I don't believe there was an interview of Secretary Clinton by the ARB, but again, you'd have to address that to Ambassador Pickering as well. And then on the third question.
I think on the list of, I believe the ARB did in fact interview 100 individuals in this ARB as well, and I'm not certain it's in the ARB the names of the people who were interviewed, but I think it may be, but I don't know if it's in a classified or unclassified version of the ARB. I would like to also point out, Congressman, which you made a very good point about the ARB in 1998 after the Kenyan bombings. One of the recommendations was, which you pointed out, which is to begin funding the construction of consulates and embassies at a pace of about 10 a year. That was the decision of the bipartisan board. They allocated at the time in 1999 about $1.5 billion, which would pay for in 1998 dollars about 10 a year. Unfortunately, that has now dropped to $700 million.
Thank you.
And we're only doing now 2 embassies a year.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Smith, and thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Sherman, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade is recognized.
I want to identify myself with the comments of the ranking member, particularly his recognition of Secretary Clinton's service to our country over the last 4 years. I want to identify myself with the comments of the gentleman from New York, particularly his call for us to rise above partisanship. We're now focused on diplomatic security. We've lost 11 diplomats in the 10 years before Benghazi, and our focus on diplomatic security was modest. But now it becomes the preoccupation of this committee and a preoccupation of foreign policy, those concerned with foreign policy nationwide. Why now? Well, partly because this time we lost an ambassador and a great man. But mostly it's because now Benghazi is not just a loss of diplomats, we've lost 11 before, but because now there's partisan advantage to be sought by one side or the other. This incident in Benghazi was important, but is it really more important than the North Korean nuclear program? Is it really more important than many of the other subjects that have not been the subject of so many hearings of this committee? We've now decided to focus on diplomatic security in part because we can blame one party or the other. We can blame the State Department for not allocating its resources to diplomatic security or blame the Republican Congress for not appropriating enough. We should do more for diplomatic security. The State Department should follow its own procedures, and we haven't done so. But we'd like to believe in a world that is subject somehow to our control, that if we just do the right thing, everything will turn out right. This is not the case. We are not that powerful, and the world is not made up that way. The fact is that bad things are going to happen to good people even if we are prudent and careful. And ultimately, the security of our diplomatic personnel depends not on our own actions, but on the host country. Ambassador Burns, just for illustration here, even if we had twice the size of the diplomatic security detail, can you be certain that our ambassador would have survived?
I'd just make two comments, Mr. Sherman. First, the security of our diplomats overseas has been a preoccupation of the Department of State throughout the 30 years I've served in the Foreign Service, and it is a priority. We clearly fell down on the job with regard to Benghazi, but we need to re-energize our efforts and be relentless in implementing the recommendations that are made in this accountability.
Ambassador, if you could just comment on the question.
Second,
if we had doubled the security effort there.
The Accountability Review Board addressed the issue. It talked about two areas of inadequacy. One of them was staffing, and in the Accountability Review Board report, they indicate that it's not certain that that one or two additional diplomatic security agents would have made a difference in the outcome. So I think
I want to get into some other issues. Obviously, the real responsibility for this heinous crime is on the perpetrators, but a big chunk of the responsibility is on the Libyan government, a government that never purged itself of its jihadist elements, a government that viewed Gaddafi as the enemy, but doesn't necessarily view the Libyan Islamic fighting group as the enemy, doesn't wage war against Ansar al-Sharia. This is the government upon whom our diplomats' lives are dependent. We have a tendency in this country to view everything as good guy and bad guy. So since Gaddafi was the bad guy, in his last few years, perhaps not as bad, since the State Department, we blocked it here, wanted to provide U.S. taxpayer money to charities controlled by Gaddafi's children. He'd gotten a little better. So, but we want to cast things as good guy, bad guy. And so since Gaddafi was the bad guy, we want to view the Libyan government as entirely the good guys. The fact is, this is a government that is a coalition that includes, or at least countenances, some of the most evil jihadist elements imaginable. Ambassador Burns, did the Libyan government allow us, our security detail traveling from Tripoli to Benghazi, to take weapons with them, or did they have to rely on the limited weapons that were available to them in Benghazi?
Mr. Sherman, this is on the night of September 11th.
This is when the ambassador flew from Tripoli to Benghazi, which I believe was a day.
I don't know the answer to that question. I can get it for you.
Please do get that, because this is a a government that has the Libyan government restricted the number of security personnel that we can have on at our diplomatic missions?
I don't know if there are any particular restrictions, and in the Accountability Review Board report, the areas of inadequacy that are identified don't have to do with Libyan government restrictions. They have to do with judgments that weren't made about increasing the number of staffing. Okay.
I'll ask you to simply answer for the record, but I believe that the Libyan government has not granted us the right to use our Air Force over their airspace to defend our diplomats in the future. Most governments wouldn't, but here's a government that can't control its own territory. And as a final comment, I'll point out that the rebels in Syria include some excellent human beings and also include some elements that are just as bad as those who attacked us in Benghazi. And we should be careful that just because Assad's a bad guy, that doesn't mean all of his enemies are good. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Rohrabacher, who is the chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized.
Thank you very much. We have several areas that just need to be clarified here, and I would just like to say that when you seek clarification and accountability and perhaps correction of policy that led to a bad result, to automatically claim that the people who are engaged in that are involved with partisan politics is itself a partisan attack. So let's just get to some of these things. We've been talking about why this happened, and there's been talk about budgets, and I want to identify myself with the remarks of our chairman, who said, yes, there are lots of things in the budget that can be reprioritized, and I'm waiting for my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to address the chairman's suggestion. If we're spending $1 billion on global warming in this budget, wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be better for all of us and more faithful to those people who are serving us to allocate those funds for security if we think there's a security problem, rather than for global warming, which is not necessarily the purview of the State Department. But in terms of, and we have to remember that Secretary Lamb, Assistant Secretary Lamb, stated, and emphatically, because it was my question and I wanted to get a specific answer, were budget considerations any part of your decision as to what level of security they should have at the Benghazi Consulate? And her answer was an emphatic no. No. So there must be policies then that we need to look at to see if it wasn't, this didn't result from budget considerations. Why did we end up having this? It was obviously a bad call on her part. And just let me say, she has given this country, I think, 20 years of decent, good service. And I'm not about to throw, sling mud at her. She maybe made a bad call. She's made 20 years of good calls. And we're discussing some of those decisions today. And Ambassador Burns, you have suggested that even adding a few extra than what she suggested was necessary probably would not have deterred this terrorist attack. So in leading up to it, we've got those questions. But then, as the terrorist attack was happening, and immediately thereafter, I'm sorry, Mr. Ambassador, but your statement that the President and Secretary Clinton made clear that it was a terrorist attack right afterwards is not true. It's not accurate. I mean, the President and high-level officials of this administration, immediately after the attack and for days afterwards, kept talking. An overwhelming part of their discussion of the issue dealt with movie rage about these Muslims being upset about portraying Muhammad in a bad way in some movie on YouTube. A huge amount of their time, and almost nothing was said by them except enough so that you could quote it now about terrorism and how the deaths there were carried out by professional and very well organized and trained terrorists. Now, about afterwards, and how we're going to come to grips with this. It was a terrorist thing that's being acknowledged now. Are we tracking down, as the Secretary of State pledged, are we tracking down these terrorists, finding out who they are? Is that happening now?
Yes, sir, it is. We're absolutely committed to using every resource of the U.S. government.
And what groups have we found were guilty of this?
Well, sir, the FBI is leading the investigation, and I'm sure in a different setting they can brief you on where things stand. All I can tell you is that the State Department is supporting very actively what the FBI is trying to do. I was in Libya in September after the Benghazi attack to push the Libyan leadership to cooperate in the investigation. Ambassador Larry Pope, our chargé on the ground in Tripoli, pushes every day.
Well, let me ask you a question on this.
Tunisia also, Congressman Rohrabacher.
Well, it's very easy to go up and ask a government, say, can you cooperate with us? And oh, of course we're going to cooperate. Let me ask you about our own investigation. The night of the attack, obviously our people weren't the only ones killed and wounded. Did our intelligence investigators, our intelligence operatives in that area, manage to go to the local hospitals and to question those people who were coming to the hospitals with bullet wounds that night?
I don't know that they were able to that night, sir. Their preoccupation was trying to deal with...
Well, what about the next day?
Well, sir, as you know, by the next morning, the American personnel in Benghazi had been evacuated to Tripoli.
And all of our intelligence operatives were gone and weren't. You know, I'll just have to tell you, I have been reading some of the classified information, and I will just tell you that I do not believe that what we did was adequate and what we are doing now is not adequate to tie this down to specific terrorist organizations. And we should be holding those people accountable and tracking them down and seeking justice for those people who we've lost. And with that said, I do not believe that holding this administration accountable for its mistakes and trying to find ways of correcting bad policy is in any way a partisan attack. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Engel, the Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere ranking member is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And let me first, before I make my remarks, I would just like to comment on two of my mentors and friends who will not be coming back, the new Congress. And I want to start with Mr. Berman, since I will be taking over his duties as ranking member of this committee, starting with the new Congress. I want to say, Mr. Berman Howard, that we are going to miss you, and your steady hand at the helm is something that we have all been aware of and we have all appreciated through the years. Your common sense on the issues, your hard work, and your collegiality is something that we will miss, and want to just express my very best wishes to you. I hope I can do as good a job as you've done, and I look forward to being in touch with you. And Mr. Ackerman, my New York buddy, we've known each other for a long, long time when we served in Albany in the state legislature together. And I think your remarks before were right on the money. And I think that your intellect, your wit, your hard work, it's been a pleasure being part of the New York delegation with you. And I know that we will continue to be in touch, certainly in New York for sure. Let me say, first of all, welcome Ambassador Burns. You have a long and distinguished record at the State Department. We appreciate the work that you've done. And Mr. Nides, I've known you for a number of years since I've been in Congress, and number of different responsibilities. And you keep getting promoted, so you must be doing something right as well. But we appreciate the work that both of you are doing, and I know it gets a little nasty here sometimes, but I think some of my colleagues don't really mean to be mean. They just get very emotional. We do appreciate your work. Let me say this. You know, one of the reasons why I love this committee is because I believe that foreign policy needs to be bipartisan. When I've taken Codels around the globe, and I've led many of them when I was chairman, the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, I found that the differences between Democrats and Republicans were very, very small when it comes to international events and things that happen. I've never had any restrictions on anyone in my Codel for speaking to foreign leaders, heads of state. Never have been embarrassed because we all understand that we're Americans and we have a common bond. And that's one of the reasons why I always enjoy this committee. But it really pains me when I see some trying to make, partisan hay on what happened in Benghazi. I think Mr. Romney did it shamefully during the campaign. And I think that in times of crisis, we need to pull together as Americans. And our ambassador was killed, and 3 other patriots were killed. And I don't think either side should try to use it for partisan political purposes. I think this kind of gotcha politics really is, American people are really turned off by it. And I want to say, I said this before in this committee, that Barack Obama was no more responsible for what happened in Benghazi than George W. Bush was for 9/11 or Ronald Reagan was when more than 200 Marines were murdered in Beirut. It doesn't happen on anybody's watch. Terrible things happen, and we need to, again, try to fix them. And I look at this report, the Accountability Review Board, as something that makes an attempt to do that. I don't care if the administration officials called it terrorism or didn't call it terrorism, and I've seen things where President Obama used the word terrorism the day after it happened, but that's not important. What's important is that there should be no more Benghazis, and that's why we're having this hearing, and that's why we have the plan, 29 points, and Secretary Clinton has accepted them all, and good for her. And she has, of course, appointed a new person, Mr. Nides. I know that's you who are really going to look at this, and I'm very, very happy that you are going to lead this task force. But Congress has its obligations too, and we have to put our money where our mouth is. If we are going to want to make sure that our diplomats are secure, then we have to pony up the money. It's very easy, and you hear rumblings in the Congress about cutting back, and let's cut foreign aid, and let's cut foreign security, and let's cut diplomatic security. It's very easy to say that. We have pressing problems here. Who cares about what happens overseas? I've heard people say that. Well, that shouldn't be. We need to care, and that's what we're doing. So let me say this. According to the CRS, Congress has underfunded State Department diplomatic security by $600 million under the request for the last 3 years. The House funding level was closer to $750 million below that. The ARB observed that funding restrictions have led the state to be resource-constrained rather than a mission-driven organization. The report continues, the ARB, that the solution requires a more serious, and I'm quoting, and sustained commitment from Congress to support State Department needs, unquote. So let me ask you this. How would the $1.4 billion requested in the increased security proposal address the ARB's concerns? Will the additional resources fill staffing shortages due to demands in the frontline states? And how will the proposal be sustained after FY 2013?
Thank you, Congressman. We made 4 decisions quickly. One was that we were going to ask for some additional money in 2013 through our budget request, which we did, which includes the $1.3 billion. That includes the additional Marines that we've asked for, more money for security, for diplomatic security, and for help for building construction. So we did that out of the 2013. We also did the ISAT teams, as you're aware, with the DOD and the state. We went out to the 19 posts around the world, the high-risk posts, to evaluate. We intend to take those ideas and come back as it relates to the 2014 budget, which we're in the midst of doing as we speak. So the 1.3 addressed what Secretary Clinton believed and the President believed was an immediate need today. But I want to be clear to all of you, we intend to come back to the Congress as it relates to 2014 to lay that out for you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. Mr. Royce, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the role that you have played in leading this committee. You've always brought energy and a smile to this committee, and we look forward to working together next year on the committee. I'd also like to wish Howard well as he moves on to the next chapter, and I'd like to say to both of you that this committee and the institution is better because of the service on your part, the leadership on your part. And we look forward to Secretary Clinton testifying next year or next month. And I think all of us want to make sure that at the end of the day, our diplomats are safer. And I look forward to working with Mr. Engel and with all the members here. We look forward to making certain that something like this does not happen again. But part of that is making the right policy decisions. Part of that goes to policy. And if we look at some of the observations that our ambassador, Chris Stevens, made, he knew that Libya had become a cauldron of weapons, of jihadists, of violent ideology. He called it a security vacuum that had developed there. And it's discouraging, frankly, to read his communiques warning of the consequences of this. And discouraging, I think, to see that there wasn't any credible contingency plan in place. An 8-hour firefight, truly tragic, without the ability to rescue our personnel during that 8 hours. And the upshot is this report, which finds a systemic failure by the State Department at senior levels. But there are other policy questions about what created this environment. And that security vacuum that we're talking about, that was compounded by certain policy choices that led to this tragic day. Policies that fed this instability in Libya. Here's a recent New York Times headline. U.S.-approved arms for Libya rebels fell into jihadists' hands. And it reports the Obama administration secretly gave its blessing to arms shipments to Libyan rebels from Qatar last year within weeks of endorsing Qatar's plan to send weapons. The White House began receiving reports that they were going to Islamic groups. This was a policy choice on the part of the administration. They decided not to send arms, but to use as a proxy Qatar for this purpose. But in turning the keys over to the Qataris, we were turning it over to someone whose views were diametrically opposed to our own. I remember the Libyan transitional authorities screaming at the time about the militants that the Qataris were picking in this fight, and what those militant jihadists would ultimately do as a result of receiving those arms, of being empowered by Qatar. I was warning the Secretary about this weapons flood from Qatar. The Times reports that the Qatari arms shipments dominated at least one of the deputies' meetings, which I assume, Ambassador, you probably attended, probably participated in. And so I was going to ask you, Secretary Burns, the Accountability Review Board had a narrow focus here. They didn't address some of the larger questions about policy, especially the policy in terms of arms that flooded that area on the part of the Qataris. Wouldn't you agree that empowering Qatar in this regard was a poor policy choice?
Well, Congressman, there was a serious concern during the Libyan revolution and in its aftermath about not only the arms that were in abundance in Libya, but also the insecurity across Libya and the difficulty that the transitional government had in restoring security and developing security.
No, I understand that, but with our tacit approval, you had 18 weapons shipments, 20,000 tons of weapons, and basically the policy choice that the Qataris would supply them, and we'd allow them to go through. On top of that, you've got, and those weapons went to the most hardcore jihadist elements. So now those weapons are spilling into Mali, where al-Qaeda affiliates have taken up shop, imposing Sharia law. I mean, this country has a history with this issue, and the decision here has been made again. And I just want your answer to that. You were cognizant of this, I know, and Ambassador Stevens was approached on this. He was rebuffed when he told an American arms dealer, don't do that. But when the dealer applied to sell Qatar $200 million in arms, that application was approved.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Royce. I'm sorry, but we're out.
Approved by state.
Thank you so much. Mr. Meeks, the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Europe and Eurasia, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I would just, for the future chair, and I appreciate his coming in, look forward to working with him, and look forward to working with Mr. Engel, and want to say thank you to both our outgoing chair and, of course, to our ranking member, who we're going to miss dearly, and my good friend, Gary Ackerman. And I just had to follow up with, I know the debate was before when we were talking about Libya, there was the argument that we needed to arm the rebels. Why do we do this without, and that's the same kind of argument that's going on right now in Syria. Some saying that we have to arm the rebels, and so, I don't know. But anyways, let me, you know, I've often said that over the years, our diplomats are really the unsung heroes of United States security. They should no longer be unsung. The attacks on our mission in Benghazi should compel Congress to better recognize that our diplomats are critical to our nation's security, and that we must do better to ensure their security. It is time for us to acknowledge, not just with our words, but also with our deeds, the importance and the danger some of America's finest public servants face abroad. With over 80 high-threat posts operating at any given time, our diplomats are often in the same kind of harm's way as our military is, without the same kind of body armor and firepower to protect themselves. We here in Congress have a role to play in giving them the resources, respect, and attention they deserve. I can't tell you how many times that I travel and I meet with an ambassador who's trying to juggle their budget. They're trying to figure out, and so oftentimes they want to say, they request, they want to figure out, here's what they have, and they say, if there's one thing that Congress can do for us is to make sure that we have the additional resources, and they do the best that they can to try to stretch that budget as much as they can. And I hope that, you know, we don't come back here next year and we start shortchanging them for what they need. But I very much want to, and I appreciate what the ARB has come forward with. To me, when I look at your report, you coming with facts, you're looking, says, yes, there were some mistakes made, and here's how we're going to correct them. And here's how we want to move forward. The Secretary of State says, I take full responsibility. So there's no ducking and there's no hiding or anything of that nature. And so I would hope that we can move on and ask. And I got a few questions I want to ask. I hope it's in the vein of what Mr. Ackerman was talking about. So, for example, we have focused on Benghazi. I would like to know what was the status, though, before Benghazi in Tripoli. Did we have any additional security in Tripoli? Was there a difference between the kind of security we had? I know one was our just a consulate. The other was the embassy, etc. What was there different requests, etc.? Could you tell me that first?
As you know, the mission in Benghazi was a temporary facility. As you know, that is where Chris Stevens started. He felt comfortable there. That was a temporary facility. The facility in Tripoli was our embassy, and it had obviously additional security in Tripoli than we did actually have in Benghazi. It was larger. We had more people there, and obviously there's a ratio between the numbers of people we have and security that were on the ground.
So now going, with the debate that we have going on now in Congress, we could have sequestration that takes place. And if sequestration takes place, there's across-the-board reductions. Has there any thought been going, what does that mean to security at our embassies and for our ambassadors?
I'm counting on all of you to fix that for us so we don't have sequestration. But if we do, we will have to make some really substantial cuts, and it will hurt. It will hurt not only diplomatic security, but make no mistake, it's not just, as your point, not just Benghazi. We have over 275 posts, embassies and consulates around the world, which dedicated diplomatic security are protecting every day. And 99% of the time, we get it right. We want to be at 100%. But you're absolutely right. We need the resources, and we hope that we won't be facing massive cuts through sequestration, which I know I probably speak for most of you around in this committee that hopes that won't occur as well.
Now, in your report, and I don't recall, I think Benghazi was, as you said, was a special mission and had a non-status. Do we deal now in any comprehensive manner with any other missions that we have that has a non-status as opposed to something that has a status? Should it be treated differently? Is that?
That is actually one of the recommendations of the ARB, that we look at that. It's clearly an issue that we need to describe. There's very few of those types of facilities, but we need to look at it, and we need to look at it. That is one of the reasons the Secretary directed us to take these teams around the most high-risk posts, because it's not just the temporary facilities, but we're dealing with a new normal. So we need to look at each and every one of those posts and make the determination on the security on the ground.
Thank you so much, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Shabbat, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Middle East and South Asia, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank you for your work in arranging for this hearing. I know it's been very difficult to get administration witnesses to testify before this committee, not just on this matter, but quite a few other things as well. And your relentless efforts to schedule this hearing are greatly appreciated by a lot of us. I also want to take a moment to thank you and say job well done. I don't know what the committee schedule is going to be for the remaining days of the 112th Congress, and we're not sure how long we're necessarily going to be around. But so in the event that this may be our last formal hearing of the year, I just wanted to commend you for the great service that you performed for this committee and our country as chair of the committee, and to thank you and your staff for the work and the many courtesies that you've extended to both me and the other members and to our staffs on both sides of the aisle. And look forward to continuing to work with you, hopefully for many years to come. I don't want to get into a long thing relative to some of the other comments I've heard from the other side of the aisle, but I have to say that in denouncing alleged partisanship, I've heard some more, I don't know that I've heard more partisan statements from some of my colleagues, and many of whom I have great respect for and wish the best in the future, because some will be leaving. But I think what this committee is attempting to do is to find out what went wrong, why, and prevent these types of things from happening again. You know, we lost the lives of 4 very patriotic Americans, and I think it's appropriate for us to look into these matters. You know, these events in Benghazi were absolutely tragic. No No question about that. Ambassador Stevens was known to many members and staff both before and during his ambassadorship, and he was thought by all, I believe, to be one of our most able diplomats. I had the opportunity to visit with him in Libya a little less than a month before he and the 3 other outstanding Americans were murdered in Benghazi. His enthusiasm for the job at hand was immediately evident. He was excited about the opportunity to help a nation newly freed from decades of brutal dictatorship, and his death was not only a terrible blow to his family and nation, but a terrible blow to those who seek to build a new democracy and a vital economy and to restore fundamental human rights for the Libyan people. We have many patriotic Americans like Chris Stevens and his colleagues serving around the world, and oftentimes they serve in dangerous regions, sometimes separated from their family, and in many cases living in a very restricted existence because of security threats. What we often take for granted, like freedom of movement and relative safety from those who would do us harm, they often live without. Today we're here to review what happened, as I said, in Benghazi and why, and what we can do to protect our diplomatic personnel stationed abroad in the future. And as has already been mentioned, the report that we've all had an opportunity to see does state that there was no protest at the American facility in Benghazi prior to the attack. And I know many members, particularly on this side of the aisle, would like to have more answers as to why exactly the White House and the State Department in the days following the Benghazi attack chose to pursue a strategy that was ham-handed at best and a cover-up at worst. I'll focus my question on the findings and recommendations of the report with the hope that one day soon we'll get a straight answer from the administration on the matter of the administration's early on insistence for weeks that terrorists were not to blame for the murders of our fellow Americans, but some video was. Ambassador Burns and Secretary Nides, we've reviewed the report and we've shifted through a lot of paperwork and that sort of things that the department provided us. We've seen cables where security officers on the ground expressed frustration at the difficulty in getting the personnel they believed they needed to protect American diplomats and property. And we now know that management of security personnel, especially the assignment of DS agents on very short-term duty, virtually guaranteeing very limited institutional knowledge, was grossly inadequate. We clearly had a problem in Libya. And it's probably fair to say that the department's shortcomings in addressing diplomatic security issues are not isolated to Libya. The Government Accountability Office has called on the department on a number of occasions, I believe, to conduct a strategic review on security mission and resources. And in light of the Benghazi tragedy, could you discuss relative to the resources that are going to be necessary in this issue? Is there a timeline on when we're actually going to get this? And in the other embassies around the world that are in security challenge areas, are these types of things in all likelihood present and need attention in other areas as well? Either one of you, I'd divide that.
We, as you know, as I mentioned earlier, we did take a very aggressive look with DOD and the State Department and sent these teams out immediately to look at every high-risk post. That's what Secretary Clinton ordered us to do. We've now bringing back those recommendations. There are many, many recommendations. We're ordering them through. She has given us very clear instructions on when she expects these results to be in, and we're going to come back to this body to get either funding that we need to them or use existing funds to actually address those issues. And the answer to that is yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Carnahan, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I just want to take a moment at the beginning of my remarks and say thank you to you and to our ranking member, Howard Berman, for their service during this Congress, your friendship, your work. Also, really to wish well our colleagues in this next Congress, the entire committee, but particularly Ed Royce and Elliot Engel as they take over the leadership of this committee. And this next Congress is going to have a full plate. I think the hearing today is really just a preview of that. I also want to acknowledge the work and leadership of Secretary Clinton. She has aggressively, her entire team, and thank you for your service, all of our diplomats everywhere, for the Secretary's leadership in embracing all 29 of the board's recommendations, and her strong commitment to have the implementation of all the recommendations well underway, even before the next Secretary of State is in place. I also want to, I guess, admonish my colleagues on the committee. There's a long tradition of bipartisanship in this committee, how we should be standing side by side when we are dealing with attacks on our people overseas. It really cheapens that to make it into some kind of a gotcha game, or to try to make it into some conspiracy to dupe voters in November by the words used or the causes of this horrible tragedy that happened in Libya. So this is really about, I believe, our foreign policy, the very core interest of our country, how we're seen around the world, our national security, our economic success, our fundamental values. That's what it's about. And it's bigger than Libya. We're going to see this in countries across the globe, country by country, these same kind of repeated challenges. We have to stay focused on that. Let's not backslide into pettiness from either side. Let's really focus on what needs to be done. And I guess for our witnesses here today, really just two quick questions. Because of this very changing nature and these increased demands that we're seeing, is there any additional country-specific criteria the State Department is considering to determine these additional security needs at our post? And secondly, what steps should be taken with host countries to honor commitments to the Vienna Convention to ensure that it is not an impediment to our security and to guarantee better the safety and security of our diplomats?
So let me just answer the first question. As I pointed out in my testimony, for 200 years we've relied on the Vienna Convention, and that is something that we have to continue to rely upon, and if we don't, we can't be in many of these places, because at the end of the day we cannot provide our own security enough to protect ourselves in these host governments. And in most, if not all, of those countries that works. But in this new environment, as we call the new normal, especially in new governments that are standing up, the Secretary implored us to go to visit those countries with the Defense Department and ask that question, which is the division between their desire to protect us and their ability to protect us. So the answer to that is we are looking at each and every one of these countries to make that determination and determine the risk factors that exist, and do we have it right as we look forward to making sure that we're protecting ourselves appropriately.
No, and all I would add, Congressman, is that this is a reality that we're going to have to deal with for some years, and not just in the Middle East, but it's particularly true there with all the revolutions and transitions that are taking place. It's post-revolutionary governments that are going to have a very difficult time building security institutions that work, and we're going to have to take that into account and adapt to it, as Tom suggested.
Yeah. Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. And thank you again for that family photo that is in some of our big photos here, Russ. Thank you. Was that your great-grandfather? Grandfather who served in the committee. Before I recognize Mr. Wilson for his questions, I'd like to advise our members that we expect a short vote series around 2:45, and that Deputy Secretaries Burns and Nides have kindly agreed to remain so that we may continue the question and answer period for the remaining members after the vote. Thank you, gentlemen. And with that, Mr. Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Madam Chairwoman, I want to thank you for your extraordinary leadership. You've been such a strong proponent on behalf of the American people. Additionally, I've certainly appreciated the bipartisan cooperation with Mr. Berman. Both of you have just come across so well. I look forward to the leadership of Chairman Royce. He and I have a shared interest in promoting a better relationship, and particularly with the very important country of India, the largest democracy on earth. And so I'm really excited about his leadership. And then I share the appreciation of Congressman Engel. He and I have gone on Codels together, and indeed there will be a bipartisan angle to this committee with Congressman Engel. So this is all positive. I am grateful, Secretary Burns, Secretary Nides, for you being here today, and I look forward to asking some questions. I do want to express again my deepest sympathy to the heroic Americans that were killed at Benghazi. We should never forget. And we want to send our deepest sympathies to the families of Ambassador Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods. These truly heroic Americans lost their lives in Benghazi to a terrorist attack, but their dedicated service will always be remembered by the American people. As we are into the Accountability Review Board evaluation that the Pickering report, there's an indication directly, the quote was, in the weeks and months leading up to the attacks, the response from the Post, Embassy, Tripoli, and Washington to a deteriorating security situation was inadequate. From each of you, what was the response, and what steps have been taken, and indeed, could this tragedy have been averted?
Well, Congressman, clearly, as the ARB report concluded, there were inadequacies. There was not an active enough response to requests that were made from Post. Just to be clear, I think typically those kind of requests, and it was true in this case, tended to come up toward the Assistant Secretary level in those bureaus, and the ARB was very clear in emphasizing the importance of us reinforcing shared responsibility in those areas. There was, and I draw a distinction between that and the more generalized concern about insecurity in Libya that I mentioned before. All of us, including the Secretary, who traveled to Libya over the course of the last year or more, were concerned about the importance of the Libyan interim government building security institutions, without which it would be extremely difficult to make a successful political transition or to rebuild the economy. And that broad issue was something that concerned many of us, including the Secretary. On the specific issue with regard to security requests, the ARB was quite clear in saying that there was an insufficient response in those areas. Those were mistakes and serious and systemic problems which are unacceptable, as I said before, and which have to be addressed to prevent a repetition of this kind of attack and this kind of tragedy in the future.
And specifically, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, has asked a question, and that is, to anyone's knowledge, has the Department of State or any federal agency requested additional U.S. military forces to augment security of U.S. personnel in Libya prior to the attack?
The ARB report, I think, addresses the issue. I mean, the specific issue of what might have been done on that night in reaction to the attack, and its conclusion is that there was simply not enough time, given the fact that even though this incident in Benghazi, the tragedy in Benghazi, unfolded over a period of 8 hours, that the intensive attacks were really focused on 2 periods, less than an hour on the special mission compound at the beginning of this ordeal, and then another very intensive attack around 5:15 the following morning on the so-called annex. And so the judgment of the Accountability Review Board was that there simply wasn't enough time to make the use of U.S. military force from outside Libya effective.
And it concerns me, too. There is a Foreign Emergency Support Team, a FES team, but yet it was not requested, it was not provided. That just is really just tragic to me.
Well, typically, Congressman, in my experience, FES teams, Foreign Emergency Support Teams, are actually deployed after a terrorist attack, and they're generally deployed when a diplomatic facility has been attacked and has lost communication capabilities and other capabilities. So a FES team comes in to augment them, but generally they come after an attack has taken place over the course of my experience.
Well, I certainly hope that, and I want to thank you for what you're doing, but my goodness, I appreciate Foreign Service officers, your courage of service, but we want the best security possible, and I appreciate whatever efforts that can be made. Thank you.
Thank you. The committee will be in recess, and we shall return after the votes. Thank you.
Well, as you heard, committee members are taking a break to attend a series of votes in the House. Lawmakers are considering two measures dealing with the tax increases and spending cuts that are set to take effect on January 1st. One, eliminating the planned Pentagon spending cuts, replacing them with cuts elsewhere. And the second bill, the Plan B bill you've heard about by Speaker Boehner, would permanently extend tax cuts on incomes under $1 million a year. We are expecting general debate on those fiscal cliff measures to start about 5 p.m. Eastern. Votes at around 8 o'clock. Live coverage from the House floor on C-SPAN. And on C-SPAN 2, the U.S. Senate's legislative